Yo, 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 what's good? What's good? Welcome back. Oh, here we are, controversial conversation. So, I hope y'all caught the last one. I believe we were talking about the dichotomy of Black Panther and Killmonger. Very interesting stuff, right? We don't ever really think about privilege from like a black perspective, but Wakanda is royalty. So therefore, Wakanda does suffer from privilege in their isolationism, and do they really owe the oppressed black communities around the world, do they owe them anything? Right? That is a very interesting just a thought experiment and stuff like that. So definitely go check that one out. If you haven't yet, definitely like, comment, subscribe, follow the channel. You already know what it is. We're building up the platform. Catch us on TikTok. We are at Jokes the Baby on TikTok. We are at Jokes the Baby on Instagram. All that good stuff. You already know what it is. Check the descriptions. I ain't even gonna belabor the point because there's something I do want to talk about today. So I don't know how this piece right here is gonna be taken, right? And I know that it's going to rub some people the wrong way. And I don't apologize for that, but I do understand where people might feel a certain way. So this is not to delegitimize the legacy of one of our greatest heroes. This is to have an honest analysis and critique of somebody that we don't necessarily do deep dives on the way that I think we should, right? So today I am going to talk about an unpopular opinion of Martin Luther King Jr. All right, here we go. All right, so Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated as the face of the civil rights movement, an advocate for nonviolence and equality. But what if his legacy isn't as untouchable as we've been told? What if his approach hurt the cause more than helped it? And his inflated legacy became a pacifier for real change? All right, let's unpack this. Part one is sympathy versus systemic change. So let's talk about sympathy without power redistribution. So nonviolence brought the brutality of segregation to light, creating public sympathy. The images from Selma and Birmingham shocked the world. But here's a key question: what did the sympathy actually accomplish? Sympathy pressured the government to act, but systemic racism remained entrenched. Here's an example. The global outrage over George Floyd's murder created a wave of protests, but policing structures remain largely unchanged. So let's talk about the persistence of racism. So the civil rights movement didn't dismantle white supremacy, it adapted. So voting rights weren't granted, but voter suppression evolved. Housing discrimination was outlawed, but redlining morphed into predatory lending. Integration laws passed, but school funding disparities persist. Racism didn't end, it just changed its face. So let's talk about legislative wins or symbolic pacifiers. So the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. See, these laws were seen as milestones, but their long term impact is debatable. Voting rights, gerrymandering, and voter ID laws now disenfranchise black voters just as effectively as Jim Crow did. And housing, black home ownership rates today are lower than during the 1960s. So we need to talk about symbolism over substance. So the legislation acted as a release valve, pacifying the movement while systemic inequality remained intact. A key question: if black people are still fighting the same battles 60 years later, was this progress or just another pacifier? Let's talk about part three and the sanitized legacy of MLK. So there's this radical king that we ignore, right? So King's later years, when he critiqued capitalism, imperialism, and systemic inequality, are often excluded from his mainstream narrative. His Poor People's Campaign called for wealth redistribution. That is a direct challenge to the power structure. And his opposition to the Vietnam War positioned him against U.S. imperialism. But why was he made palatable? Well, by focusing on King's earlier nonviolent rhetoric, his legacy became a safe symbol for white America. Malcolm X was dismissed as too radical, but King's sanitized image allowed him to be celebrated without threatening the system. King got a holiday because he became a symbol, not because his work dismantled the structures of white supremacy. Let's talk about part 4, the nonviolent approach. Is it performative or is it actually powerful? So, nonviolence as strategic optics. So, King's nonviolence was effective in highlighting the moral failings of segregation. The strategy worked to gain allies and international sympathy during the Cold War. But another key question comes into play. But did it challenge the structures of power or just create a more comfortable version of oppression? So here's the critique of performative mobilization. Large scale marches like the March on Washington were meticulously curated to avoid radical rhetoric. So while visually powerful, they often prioritize comfort over confrontation. King's approach appealed to moderates but didn't demand the systemic change Malcolm X or the Black Panthers advocated for. So, real quick, I want to do something that I know we hate in our community when we compare our Black heroes and our Black leaders, but this is just for context and not to say one is better than the other. But real quick, doing a comparison of MLK's strategies and ideologies against Malcolm X's philosophical methods and beliefs. So King sought reform within the system, while Malcolm X called for revolution and self-determination. King's focus on integration and unity catered to the power structure, whereas Malcolm's critiques of white supremacy, capitalism, and global oppression made him a threat. So who was the real threat? King's pivot to radical critiques coincided with his assassination, which suggests he became a threat only when he moved beyond nonviolence and integration. Malcolm X was killed because he was a revolutionary from the start. King became a threat when he started talking about redistribution and reparations. Part 6, sympathy, it just ain't enough. Let's talk about the illusion of moral awakening. The argument that nonviolence shifted public sentiment ignores the persistence of systemic racism. White moderates supported by the civil rights movement, white moderates supported the civil rights movement but continued voting for policies that upheld inequality. Outrage over the crack epidemic, AIDS, and mass incarceration was absent despite their devastating effects on Black communities. So why the system didn't flinch? It's because sympathy created performative change but didn't disrupt power dynamics. Structural racism adapted to maintain control. And if sympathy didn't lead to accountability or redistribution of power, was it ever real? So here's the conclusion. It's a legacy that is worth re-examining. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is powerful, but incomplete. His work illuminated the moral failures of segregation, but the structures of white supremacy remain intact. His nonviolent approach created moments of progress, but failed to achieve systemic change. The sanitized version of King we celebrate today has become a pacifier, a way to applaud past victories without addressing present injustices. Malcolm X once said, "You can't have a revolution without bloodshed." King's life challenges us to ask, can you? Was his nonviolence the ultimate act of courage or a strategy that allowed white supremacy to adapt and persist? Let's rethink the legacy we've been given and ask, what does real progress look like?